The announcement came quietly at first, wrapped not in scandal or secrecy but in a kind of solemnity that only long-time ministry followers could understand. Hear what he said.
Hello, Leading the Way, partners and friends around the world. We have good news for you. In the next 6 months, I will be passing the baton in the Church of the Apostles to my son Jonathan, and I'm going to be at Leading the Way full-time.
Yet for thousands of Daystar viewers across the country, the message landed like a tremor that traveled through living rooms, smartphones, prayer groups, study fellowships, and every corner where the name Michael Youssef meant more than just another preacher on another Christian program. It meant consistency. It meant a familiar voice of Scripture. It meant someone whose sermons had been woven into their Sunday mornings, late-night reflections, and private seasons of spiritual searching. So when word began to spread that Michael Youssef was stepping down from his pastoral role, the wave of reactions came not because people feared scandal, but because the transition signaled something emotional, something symbolic, something that touched on the nature of legacy, leadership, and what it means when a spiritual pillar shifts positions after more than 3 decades of service. For many viewers, especially those deeply engaged with Daystar programming, this was bigger than a minister changing responsibilities. It felt like the closing of a chapter, an era defined by firm preaching, conservative theological grounding, and a certain unshakable clarity that Michael Youssef had maintained while the wider Christian world experienced all kinds of turbulence. Daystar had aired his messages for years, delivering his voice into millions of homes, and in that time he became a recognizable presence, one not easily replaced or overlooked. That's why the announcement triggered a nationwide conversation, because even though he wasn't stepping down from Daystar itself, the pastoral transition represented the first major shift in his ministry identity in decades. People remembered the early days, when Dr. Youssef first emerged on the American Christian landscape with a distinct accent, an unmistakable intensity, and a preaching style that refused to water down Scripture even as cultures shifted around him. They remembered how Daystar helped amplify his reach, allowing his sermons from the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta to find a home on international broadcasts. For years, his messages formed part of the stable backbone of Daystar's lineup, and viewers grew attached to the certainty that whenever he appeared on screen, the sermon would be unapologetically direct. He had carved out a reputation as someone who championed faith with both conviction and gentleness, insisting that the gospel did not need to be modernized, it only needed to be preached. So his decision to step down as senior pastor was not dismissed as a simple staffing change within a local church. Instead, it became a moment of collective reflection, especially among Christian audiences who had already felt the losses and transitions within the Daystar family over the last few years. It seemed to symbolize the ongoing evolution of Christian broadcasting leaders, an unfolding generational shift, and the complicated emotions that come when a familiar voice signals that a new chapter is beginning. The announcement itself was calm, delivered with gratitude and hope, not sorrow. Dr. Youssef explained that the time had come for him to shift into a role that allowed him to focus fully on national and international ministry, something he had already been doing, but now felt called to expand even further. He was not retiring, not disappearing, not stepping away from preaching. Instead, he was passing the local leadership mantle to his youngest son, a move that resonated deeply with viewers who valued continuity and legacy. This father-to-son transition reminded people that ministry was never meant to be a solitary assignment. It was meant to be generational, like a flame passed from one steady hand to another. Almost immediately, conversations began to spread online. Some saw the move as a strategic preparation for a broader global mission, one that demanded his full attention at this stage in his life. Others wondered whether the changing landscape of Christian media, especially after the losses and controversies surrounding major networks including Daystar, had influenced his desire to focus on more direct forms of outreach. Still others simply felt nostalgia, recalling how his voice had guided them through their toughest seasons, and hoping that Daystar would continue to air his teachings without interruption. Viewers reminisced about the sermons that had marked their lives. They remembered the seasons of crisis when he preached on faith that stands when everything else is shaking. They remembered his strong emphasis on the authority of Scripture, the centrality of Christ, and the call to moral courage. Many wrote heartfelt messages across social platforms, saying that his teachings were the reason they turned back to God, or the reason they kept going during moments of despair. There were countless stories of people who watched Daystar late at night, stumbled upon one of his messages, and found themselves in tears because the sermon addressed exactly what they were going through. That emotional connection formed the backbone of the nationwide reactions. It wasn't simply about leadership transition. It was about the personal bonds built through years of spiritual influence. For millions, especially older believers who watched Daystar faithfully, Michael Youssef felt like part of the family, a voice they trusted, a steadying presence amid the chaos of modern Christian discourse. And so the news of his stepping down as pastor carried a weight far beyond Atlanta. It reached homes in rural areas where Daystar remained one of the few dependable sources of Christian teaching. It reached families who had followed his teachings for decades. It reached communities that felt spiritually anchored by his sermons. As discussions grew, many people expressed relief that he wasn't stepping away from preaching entirely. His ministry leading the way was not only continuing but expanding, and his pastoral exit was designed to strengthen that global mission, not weaken it. In fact, some believers saw the move as a sign of strategic wisdom, stepping aside from the demands of local weekly leadership in order to pursue the broader calling he had always carried, to bring biblical truth to the nations. That realization transformed the shock into a different kind of excitement. It allowed viewers to interpret the transition not as an ending, but as a repositioning. A man of faith stepping into a role that allowed him to devote himself fully to the work he believed he was created for. People began discussing what this might mean for Daystar programming. Many expected more frequent special broadcasts, extended teachings, international mission updates, and global outreach episodes featuring his work in regions that rarely receive coverage on American Christian television. Some speculated that this shift could signal a new era of partnership between his ministry and networks like Daystar, where global missions could be showcased more boldly and consistently. At the same time, nostalgia mingled with hope. People reflected on how ministries evolve, how leadership seasons change, and how these transitions remind the Christian world that faith is not anchored in individuals, but in the God who guides them. The fact that Michael Youssef chose to pass leadership to his son carried powerful symbolic weight. It demonstrated a commitment to continuity and stability, rather than disruption. It also demonstrated that he trusted the next generation to carry the flame forward. For many viewers who had watched Daystar struggle with leadership transitions of its own, this father-to-son handoff felt refreshing, an example of transparency, intention, and preparedness. Still, the biggest questions people asked were emotional ones. Would his preaching feel different now? Would stepping away from weekly local pastoral duties create a new tone in his messages? Would Daystar continue airing his sermons with the same frequency? Would this shift change how he addressed cultural issues, spiritual warfare, or global missions? And how would his expanded international focus impact the American audience that had followed him faithfully for decades? In response, many Christian commentators highlighted a simple truth. When a man of consistent conviction expands his mission, the ripple effect often strengthens believers rather than disorients them. They pointed out that Dr. Youssef's messages had always carried a global tone, always concerned with both the spiritual battles in the West and the challenges faced by Christians in places where faith came with real danger. Now, freed from certain administrative responsibilities, he might be able to speak even more boldly, travel more freely, and reach audiences that had previously been out of reach. As the days passed, the national conversation deepened. Pastors discussed the significance of long-serving leaders choosing the right moment to transition. Ministry analysts focused on how this move could shape global evangelism strategy. Daystar viewers shared memories, hopes, and prayers for the next phase of his journey. And through it all, Michael Youssef remained steady, not fueling drama, not seeking applause, simply reiterating that obedience to God's call had always been his primary mission. The nationwide reactions continued because his stepping down represented something larger than one man's decision. It tapped into the shared emotional landscape of Christians who had been navigating the rapid changes in faith leadership, media platforms, cultural pressures, and spiritual expectations. It reminded people of how deeply they rely on familiar voices, how much they value stability, and how change, even positive strategic change, can stir something within the soul. And yet, from the center of all the conversation, one truth became increasingly clear. Michael Youssef was not stepping down in weakness. He was stepping forward in purpose. The transition was not the diminishing of his calling, but the refocusing of it. For Daystar viewers, the shift did not mean losing a favorite minister. It meant witnessing the evolution of a voice they trusted, seeing him enter a stage where he could impact the world even more widely than before. It meant being part of the journey of a leader whose faithfulness had earned their respect, and whose next chapter promised to be just as influential as the ones that came before. And so the story continued to unfold. Not with scandal, not with confusion, but with a collective sense of watching a spiritual figure take a step that resonated across the nation. It became a story of passing the torch, of embracing new assignments, of maintaining legacy while expanding mission. It became a reminder that faith leadership is ultimately a journey of seasons, and that when a trusted voice steps into a new season, the people who have walked with him often feel the shift as though it happened in their own families. That is why the announcement sparked nationwide reactions. Because for millions, Michael Youssef is more than a pastor. He is a symbol of unwavering biblical conviction, a familiar voice on Daystar, a guide through spiritual storms, and a reminder that God is still raising leaders who finish their seasons well. And now, as he steps into a new phase of global ministry, viewers across the country watch with both gratitude and anticipation, knowing that even though roles have shifted, the mission continues, perhaps stronger than ever before. In the end, the reactions that swept across the country after Michael Youssef stepped down from his pastoral role revealed something deeper than surprise or uncertainty. They revealed just how much his voice, his teachings, and his steady presence had meant to millions of believers who grew with him through the screens of Daystar and through the quiet moments of personal faith. This transition reminded people that ministry is a living journey, one that shifts as God redirects his servants toward new fields, new battles, and new victories. And even though many felt the weight of change, they also sensed the promise of something greater. An expansion of purpose, a widening of influence, a fresh chapter still rooted in the uncompromising message he has preached for decades. As viewers across the nation waited to see how this new phase would unfold, one thing remained certain. Michael Youssef was not stepping away, he was stepping forward. His voice would still be heard. His mission would still continue. And in many ways, this moment marked not the end of a season, but the beginning of a larger story, one that would likely touch even more lives than before. Daystar audiences, longtime followers, and new believers alike now watched with renewed attention, understanding that sometimes the greatest impact begins exactly at the point where a familiar chapter closes and a new one quietly begins.